The cowboy blinked. Sunlight burned the horizon behind her, but her voice cut through it like a gunshot. "I'll become your wife." She said it in broken English, her hands trembling, her lips cracked from Texas heat. She didn't smile. She didn't blush. She just stood there barefoot in an old uniform that hung off her frame like a scarecrow's flag. He'd brought her soup, nothing more, and now this. The other girls were laughing inside the barn, playing cards with the guards. Chickens pecked in the dirt nearby. But here, between them, something surreal had just bloomed. He looked at her, this enemy soldier who weighed less than his saddle, and saw not seduction, not desperation, but something stranger, a plea for belonging. Later, when the other cowboys asked what she said, he didn't answer. Because how do you explain that the war had ended, but someone just proposed a different kind of surrender? The wind picked up just then, kicking dust across the yard like a curtain trying to close on an unfinished play. He stood there, stew still warm in the tin cup he'd brought, and watched her face. She didn't blink. Her hands were clenched by her sides, not in defiance, not in desperation, just still, like a tree in the middle of a storm that had already passed. Behind them, the barn door creaked. Laughter echoed faintly from the other girls inside, as if the world hadn't just tilted on its axis. James didn't say a word. He wasn't sure he could. The guards nearby had heard it too. One of them let out a snort. Another tipped his hat back and muttered, "She's just confused. Doesn't know what she's saying." But they kept glancing his way, waiting to see what he'd do. James didn't move. He stared at her, at this girl with sunburnt cheeks and eyes like dark stones, and something tightened in his chest. Not affection, not yet, just recognition that he was looking at someone who had been through hell and come out the other side barefoot. Aiko didn't look away. The words she had learned, the ones she had practiced silently at night under a wool blanket, tracing letters in the air, had landed in the dirt between them like a dropped match. She didn't know what came next. She only knew that this man had given her food without asking anything in return. In her world, that didn't exist. In her world, there was always a price. So she had offered the only thing she thought might matter, herself. The cowboy took off his hat, not in flirtation, not in respect, just to buy time. His scalp prickled in the sunlight. He scratched the back of his neck and finally said, "That stew ain't marriage." Aiko tilted her head slightly, unsure if it was rejection. She didn't understand all the words, but she heard the tone. It was soft. It wasn't a no. He handed her the cup. She took it, both hands trembling. That was the moment everyone would remember, the moment the war slipped out of the room like a shadow. Later, James would try to explain it to himself. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was just a bad joke written by God. But when he looked at her, he didn't see an enemy. He saw someone who had nothing left. Not even shoes. Not even a language. And he remembered something his father used to say during hard winters. Don't measure a man's dignity by his coat. Measure it by how he wears the cold. She stood in front of him with nothing, but she stood tall. That night James sat on the edge of his bunk, staring at the barn wall. He could still hear her voice, not pleading, just honest. And as the Texas moon hung low in the sky, the story started to shift. It didn't begin with love. It began with hunger. Aiko's story, how she came to stand barefoot in Texas, offering her life to a stranger, started thousands of miles away, in a city that no longer had a name. Before the surrender. Before the stew. Before the word wife. Back then, she was just a grocer's daughter in Hiroshima, folding dried seaweed and sweeping the front step of her family's tiny shop. The neighborhood was poor but familiar. The days were long, filled with ration lines and air raid drills. Her mother boiled weeds for dinner. Her father whittled wooden spoons to trade for salt. They listened to the Emperor's voice crackle from a neighbor's radio, speaking in metaphors and silence. But nothing prepared her for the flash. That morning she had been tying her shoes. The sky turned white, then red, then black. Her father never came home. Her mother's lungs filled with smoke and blood. Her brother vanished into the military like a pebble dropped in a well. And Aiko learned what it meant to disappear. She stopped speaking for weeks. She wandered the ruins with a blank stare and blistered feet until someone from the local military hospital took her in. They gave her a uniform, a job, and a word for what she was now: Teishintai, volunteer girl, assistant, servant, disposable. She folded linens and learned to say, endure. She watched young men die quietly. She learned how to tie off arteries and how to hide pain behind her teeth. The war taught her silence. America would teach her something else. But not yet. For now her hands clutched the stew. Her feet stayed planted in the Texas dirt. And her words, those impossible words, still lingered in the air like smoke. Before the war, Aiko's world was no bigger than her father's shop. A narrow wood-framed building nestled between a sake house and a noodle stand on the edge of Hiroshima's market district. Every morning she swept the front step with a straw broom, tracing lazy circles in the dust while her father arranged crates of rice and dried seaweed beneath the awning. Her mother sliced pickled radish with a dull knife, humming songs from a time before soldiers marched in the streets. Her older brother, Haruki, teased her endlessly, tossing soybeans at her back while pretending to be a war hero. She didn't mind. The teasing meant he was still there. The family ate simple meals on the floor, drank tea out of chipped porcelain cups, and prayed with quiet voices before bed. Air raid sirens came and went, but Hiroshima always seemed one step removed from the thunder of war. The newspapers printed victory headlines in bold ink. The radio told stories of divine wind and imperial destiny. But on the street, people whispered of hunger and death. Aiko was 14 when she learned to ignore the noise. The silence between the headlines was where the truth lived. Then came August. The morning of the blast was hot, thick with stillness. The sky was blue, too blue, as if it didn't know what was coming. Aiko had just stepped into the back room to fetch a broom when the world exploded. There was no warning, no siren, no time, just a light, white and soundless, that swallowed everything. When she opened her eyes, the walls were gone. The sky was on fire. Her arms were scorched. Her eardrums rang like bells hit with hammers. And her father was no longer standing in the doorway. His stall, his crates, his voice erased. Her mother survived for 3 more days. Skin burned black, eyes clouded, hair falling in clumps onto the tatami mats. Aiko held her hand through the fever, whispering apologies she didn't understand. She watched the flesh slip from her mother's body like it no longer wanted to stay. And then the breath stopped. Haruki had vanished weeks before, conscripted into the army with a wooden rifle and a cloth headband. No letters came, no word, just silence. Aiko buried her mother beneath the cinders of the garden and walked away. She had no home, no food, no reason, but her legs kept moving. She wandered for days through the gray skeleton of her city. The smell of ash clung to her like smoke that refused to let go. She slept in alleys, ate scraps from gutters, and listened to the buzzing of flies over bodies no one had time to bury. Then a soldier found her, Or maybe she found him. He stood outside a field hospital shouting for volunteers, girls between the ages of 13 and 17, strong enough to carry a pail, quiet enough not to ask questions. In exchange, food, shelter, a uniform. Aiko stepped forward. She was issued a gray tunic, a red armband, and a number. Her name was no longer required. Inside the hospital, she was taught to scrub floors until her knees bled, to wring bandages without wasting a single drop of iodine. She carried stretchers with boys screaming into cloth, changed sheets soaked with what used to be inside someone. She folded the same piece of paper a dozen times to write a letter for a dying soldier who could no longer hold a pen. They called her Taishantai. It meant Volunteer Corps. But it wasn't a choice. It was a sentence. Every night she recited the same lines. The Emperor is our father. Surrender is shame. Endure. She whispered it like a prayer, not because she believed it, but because there was nothing else to say. They fed the girls half a bowl of rice a day. Aiko shared hers with a younger girl who couldn't stop shaking. When they asked why, she said nothing. Kindness was dangerous. Kindness was remembered. Then, in mid-August, the shouting stopped. The nurses stood still. The officers turned away from the radios. The war was over. But no one explained what that meant. The men vanished. The girls were told to wait. Some waited in the shade of trees. Some waited beside the wounded. Aiko waited in silence. When the Americans came, they didn't shout. They didn't strike. They carried clipboards. Aiko didn't know what it meant. She only knew they loaded her onto a truck and drove her away from the ruins. She looked back once. Her city, her life, reduced to smoke. She never saw it again, and she never stopped walking forward. At the field camp where the trucks dropped her, the war still echoed in orders barked too loudly and footsteps that never approached softly. Aiko was handed over to a remnant of officers who hadn't yet accepted surrender. They wore dusty uniforms with fraying hems, still saluted invisible flags, and clung to rules like dying men cling to breath. Here, surrender was not an option. It was a sickness. "Better to drown yourself than be captured," one officer hissed as he pounded the table with his fist. "To live in enemy hands is to spit on your ancestors." They called it Bushido, the warrior's way. But for the girls, it was a language of fear dressed up as honor. Aiko, like the others, was taught to serve without question. They weren't soldiers. They were shadows. They cleaned latrines, boiled water, patched uniforms. They were told they were lucky to have purpose. And every night, as the sun melted into the dust, the same mantra floated through the canvas walls of the sentence. To be captured is to be dead. Aiko repeated it with the others, her voice steady but hollow. She didn't believe in death as much as she believed in absence. Her father, her mother, her brother. All absent now. The words felt like paper, light, flammable, and easy to tear. But still, she said them. Then the silence came. One morning the officers were gone. No explanation, no orders, just vanished. Some girls thought they had fled into the hills to die with dignity. Others whispered that they had been taken, hauled away by foreign troops or their own ashamed comrades. No one knew. What remained was confusion. Then trucks. American soldiers, tall, sunburned, speaking a language that bounced like stones over water, approached the girls not with weapons raised, but with strange expressions. Not pity, not rage. Something more unsettling. Procedure. They counted them, separated them, recorded names. Some girls gave false ones, still afraid of being traced, punished, erased. Aiko said nothing. She didn't care what name they wrote. Hers belonged to another world. They were herded into open-bed trucks like livestock. Some cried, some tried to run. The Americans didn't stop them. But where was there to go? The mountains? The sea? One girl jumped anyway, her body twisted mid-air. She landed wrong, her leg bending at an angle it shouldn't. The Americans stopped the truck. One soldier rushed to her, another offered water. No beatings, no bullets, just care. That frightened the girls more than violence would have. When they reached the port, ships loomed like iron clouds. The ocean was a color Iko had never seen before, deep, bottomless, the color of uncertainty. They were led up ramps into the belly of one of the vessels. Below deck, they found rows of bunks, metal trays, and the smell of something cooking, something that wasn't rice or miso or boiled cabbage. It was thick, foreign, greasy. Her stomach twisted, not from hunger, but disbelief. Iko lay in a bunk that night with a blanket that didn't itch and a pillow that wasn't made of straw. She didn't trust it. None of them did. They whispered in the dark, crouched on steel floors, guessing what the real plan was. One girl said they'd be taken to a prison and executed for propaganda films. Another said they'd be sterilized. Another said nothing, just stared at the ceiling, rocking gently with the rhythm of the ship. Aiko didn't sleep. She watched the rivets in the hull, counted them, tried to listen past the groan of metal for a sign of fate. The journey took weeks, or maybe days. Time bent in the dark. Meals came regularly, bread, meat, sometimes even fruit. The Americans passed them out without looking them in the eye. That, too, felt worse than hatred. The girls hoarded what they could, stuffing crusts into their tunics, hiding apple cores like treasures. And slowly, against their will, their bodies began to fill out again. Bones disappeared beneath skin. Wounds scabbed over. Hair stopped falling out, but the fear never left. Every port they passed, every horn that blew, was a fresh reminder that they were headed deeper into the unknown. One night, Aiko stood at the edge of the upper deck. The stars were strange here, too many of them. She wondered if her brother could see the same sky. She closed her eyes and waited for the next command. But it didn't come. Only wind, only salt, only the quiet creak of a ship taking her farther away from everything she had ever known. When the ship finally docked, Aiko expected to see prison walls, barbed wire, men with rifles yelling in a language she couldn't understand. She braced herself for boots, for blindfolds, for pain delivered without explanation. Instead, what she saw when she stepped off the truck in Texas was dust. Just endless, golden-brown dust curling around her ankles like a whisper. The sun was a hammer in the sky. It pressed down on her skull like it wanted to crack her open. Her uniform, still the same thin gray one from the hospital, clung to her body like a second skin, soaked in sweat and creased with travel. Her stomach felt hollow, her mouth dry as paper. But what truly disoriented her were the hats. The guards weren't dressed like soldiers. They wore jeans, boots, and wide-brimmed hats that looked like something out of a theater play. One had a toothpick in his mouth. Another had a rifle slung low on his back, not at the ready, but like it was part of his belt. And they weren't shouting. They just waited. Aiko stepped off the truck and looked around. No barbed wire, no towers, no dogs, just a long, sagging fence surrounding a field with grazing cattle, a barn with flaking red paint, and a few scattered buildings that looked like abandoned farmhouses. One of the men squinted at her. Then, to her utter confusion, he tipped his hat. It wasn't mockery, it wasn't flirtation. It was a gesture so mundane, so human, that she nearly collapsed. Her legs held barely, but her chest felt like it had forgotten how to breathe. Iko was led toward a barn with two other girls. Inside it was cool, dim. The air smelled of hay and leather and something sharp, disinfectant maybe, or old whiskey. The walls were lined with wooden stalls. Horses shifted in the shadows. A cot had been made in one corner, with a folded wool blanket placed neatly on top. She didn't move toward it. She waited, back straight, eyes low, the way she'd been taught. But no one barked at her. No one shoved her. A man, older, with deep lines carved into his face, gestured to the cot. "You can sit," he said. Slowly, like he knew she didn't understand the words, but might feel the rhythm of kindness. She didn't sit. Not yet. Instead, she listened. To the rustle of cattle outside, to the soft ring of a bell tied around a goat's neck, to a radio playing somewhere in the distance, the melody foreign and warm. Then came the smell. It drifted in like a spell, meaty, thick, impossible. Her stomach twisted. Her body knew it before her mind did. Food. Moments later, a younger cowboy entered holding a tin cup. He didn't come close. He knelt by the stove in the corner, stirred the contents, then brought the cup to her and placed it gently on the floor. She stared at it. Steam curled from the surface. Brown, greasy. Something floated in it. Carrot, maybe, or onion. She didn't reach for it, because this was it, wasn't it? This was the trick, the trap, the test. Kindness was always followed by cruelty. That was the rule, but the cowboy didn't wait. He just nodded once and walked away. Iko looked at the cup, then at the cot, then at the cowboy's back. She felt her body begin to sway. And when she finally knelt and lifted the cup to her lips, the heat hit her like a memory she wasn't ready for. Her eyes stung. She took one sip, then another. Nothing happened, no laughter, no punishment, just warmth sliding down her throat. Later that night, wrapped in the wool blanket, she would lie awake for hours, staring at the rafters above her head, wondering when the pain would start, when the slap would come. But it didn't. There was only the creak of the barn, the distant hum of insects, and the strange, infuriating quiet of a country that didn't seem to hate her. It wasn't comfort, not yet. But it wasn't hell either, and that was enough to terrify her. The next morning, the smell hit her like a slap. Sharp, greasy, rich. It wrapped around her like a fog that didn't ask permission. Iko sat upright on the cot, her stomach already twisting in anticipation. Or was it dread? The cowboy from before entered the barn with a tin plate, steaming and humming something under his breath. He didn't speak, just crouched and placed the plate near her feet before tipping his hat and disappearing again. On the plate were strips of something dark pink and curling, slick with oil. Beside it, bread and a pile of white powdery stuff she would later learn was eggs. She reached slowly, pinched a corner of the bacon between two fingers, and brought it to her mouth. The salt hit first, then fat, then smoke, and then the nausea. Not because it tasted bad, but because it tasted like survival. Her mother had died on boiled weeds. Her brother had eaten rats when they could find them. This absurd richness, this luxury of grease and crunch, felt like a betrayal of everything she had lost. She forced herself to chew. She didn't cry, not visibly, but her shoulders shook, and when she swallowed, it tasted like ash. That night the barn filled with a sound she couldn't name at first. Not footsteps, not shouting. Something slow, melodic. It came from just outside, where the men gathered near the fire after chores. One of the younger ones, he had a scar across his chin and always wore his sleeves rolled high, held something small and shiny to his mouth. He blew into it gently, bending the sound into notes. Music. Aiko had heard music before: patriotic marches, radio propaganda, drums of empire. But this was different. This wasn't meant to command. This was meant to feel. The harmonica wept and laughed at the same time. Aiko crept closer to the barn door, crouching low in the straw, just close enough to see shapes in the firelight. One cowboy tapped his boot in time with the tune. Another whittled a piece of wood slowly, his face lit orange by the flames. Someone chuckled. Not loudly, just enough to break the night open a little. She wanted to look away. She was supposed to. Everything in her training had taught her that the enemy was cold, cruel, and unworthy of empathy. That music like this, soft, playful, unnecessary, was proof of weakness. But her heart didn't believe it. She didn't understand the notes, but she understood the ache. The melody reached inside her chest and curled around something small and shivering. And for the first time in what felt like years, she closed her eyes and didn't see fire. She saw her father's hands counting coins at the stall, her mother rinsing rice, Haruki drawing soldiers on the back of rice sacks. She opened her eyes before the tears could fall. Back inside the barn, the tin plate from breakfast still sat near her cot. She picked up the last piece of bacon with shaking fingers. This time she ate it quickly, not out of hunger, not out of rebellion, but out of defiance. Defiance of the part of her that still clung to the idea that pain was holy and joy was betrayal. The wall inside her didn't break. Not yet, but something small cracked, and in that crack the music poured in, not like a flood, like a whisper, telling her she was still alive. The next day, Aiko was handed a bucket and pointed toward the chicken coop. The gesture was clear, even without shared words. She followed the fence line, past sun-bleached posts and buzzing flies, until she reached the crooked wooden shed that housed the ranch's birds. The coop smelled of feathers, droppings, and straw. It was a messy, living thing. Chickens clucked and pecked the ground with insistent rhythm, paying her no mind. She hesitated at first, unsure of where to step or how to hold the feed pail. But no one corrected her. No one stood behind her with folded arms or raised voices. So she began. She scattered grain, collected eggs with fingers that still trembled, cleaned the straw in slow, circular motions. At first, it felt mechanical, just another task in a life of endless obedience. But after a few days, she noticed something strange. Her hands no longer shook. Her shoulders relaxed. Her breath settled into the same rhythm as the birds. Routine, not punishment, not preparation for pain, just routine. One afternoon, after a storm had blown through the previous night, she found the fence near the pasture half collapsed. Splintered wood leaned at odd angles, and the wire sagged like a tired spine. She stood frozen, expecting a flurry of boots and shouting. In Japan, damage like this would have been followed by blame, by discipline. But instead, she saw the cowboy, the same one who had played the harmonica. He arrived carrying a coil of rope and a hammer. His shirt was rolled to the elbows. His face was quiet, not angry, not performative. He didn't curse the wind. He didn't blame the animals. He just knelt in the dirt and began to work. Aiko watched from the coop, barely breathing. He pulled each nail with care, set new posts in the ground, checked the tension of the wire. When a horse wandered too close, he gently pressed its neck and whispered something. The animal turned without protest. There was no shouting, no domination, only precision, patience, respect. It was the first time Aiko had seen strength expressed without fear. She remembered the officers back home, their barked orders, their flaring tempers. Power had always meant violence, or the threat of it. But here, power looked like a man wiping sweat from his brow and pausing only to sip from a tin cup before finishing the job. She didn't understand it, and that not understanding cracked something deeper. That night, after the dishes were done and the chickens roosted in their boxes, Iko curled into the corner of the barn and buried her face in the blanket. She didn't cry for her parents, not for her brother. She cried because of the way the man had fixed the fence, because no one had yelled, because the horse had trusted him, because the world she had been taught was built on shame, and sacrifice had never made space for quiet dignity. And now that she had seen it, touched it, it terrified her. Dignity, she realized, could exist without uniforms, without flags. It could live in a fence mended by hand, in a chicken fed before dawn, in a barn that did not demand her obedience, only her presence. She cried not from sadness, but from the terror of possibility. If this was real, if kindness was not a mask, but a truth, then everything else might have been a lie, and that lie had been the only thing keeping her upright. She cried until the blanket soaked through. Then she slept. And in the morning she fed the chickens again. The sun rose slow and pale, stretching over the fields like a cautious hand. Aiko carried the tin bucket with both arms, its weight familiar now, almost comforting. The chickens rushed her feet, feathers brushing her ankles, their hunger uncomplicated and loud. She scattered the grain, watching how quickly chaos turned into order, how even the smallest creatures knew exactly where to be when food appeared. That was when he came again. The cowboy. James, she had learned his name from the way the others called to him. He walked up the fence line with an easy gait, boots thudding softly against packed dirt. He carried something small in his palm. When he reached her, he held it out, not offering it, just showing it. "Spoon," he said slowly. She stared at the object, a spoon, smooth, metal, curved like a half-moon. "Spoon," she repeated, careful with the sound, letting it roll around her tongue. His mouth twitched. Not a smile exactly, but close. He nodded once, satisfied, and gestured toward the feed bucket, then to his mouth. "Soup." She nodded. "Soup." It was nothing, a word, a sound shared between two people who did not share a language, but something loosened in her chest, something she hadn't known was clenched so tightly. The lessons continued in fragments like that, not formal, not structured, just moments snatched between chores. He would point, she would repeat. Sometimes he corrected her. Sometimes he laughed when she got it wrong, not cruelly, not loudly, but with a quiet warmth that made her cheeks burn. "Cow," he said, tapping the fence post. "Cow," she echoed. He grinned. "Good." That word, good, settled into her bones. In the evenings, when the sun dipped low and the sky turned copper, she would sit on the edge of the barn with her back against the wood, listening. The men gathered near the fire again. Someone always brought the harmonica. The sound curled through the air, soft and searching. She didn't know the songs, but she recognized the feeling, longing, memory, something aching and gentle all at once. One night she laughed. It startled her so badly she covered her mouth, eyes wide, as if she had committed a crime. The sound had escaped her before she could stop it, a quick, surprised breath that turned into a small, fragile laugh. It came from somewhere deep, a place that had been silent for too long. James looked over, eyebrows lifting. He didn't mock her. He didn't stare. He just smiled, wide and unguarded, as if the sound pleased him more than the music itself. That was when she understood. Laughter was not weakness here. It was allowed. It was safe. Later, as they sat near the fence, she pointed to herself and said her name again, slowly, carefully. "I, He repeated it, mispronouncing the ending. She corrected him. He tried again and again, until she nodded. Then he pointed to his own chest. "James." She repeated it, and this time he laughed outright, a full sound that echoed across the field. She laughed too, unable to stop herself. The sound startled the horses, and for a moment the world felt lighter than it had in years. They didn't talk about the war. They didn't talk about where she came from or what she had lost. Their words were simple, practical. Spoon, water, bread, sun, night. And yet in those small exchanges something larger grew. She was no longer invisible. She was not a shadow moving through other people's lives. She was someone who could be named, who could speak and be understood. That night, lying on her cot, she replayed the sound of her own laughter in her head. It felt foreign, almost dangerous, but also warm. The idea crept into her thoughts, unwelcome and undeniable. Maybe the enemy was not who she had been taught to fear. Maybe the real danger had always been the silence. And for the first time since the world ended, she fell asleep without dreaming of fire. When morning came, it came gently. No sirens, no shouted orders, only the sound of boots in the dirt and the low murmur of cattle being moved from one pen to another. Iko woke to pale sunlight creeping across the barn floor, dust drifting lazily through it like something alive. She lay still for a long moment, listening. The fear that usually snapped her awake did not arrive. Instead, there was only quiet, and beneath it a strange sense of steadiness she didn't recognize as her own. She sat up and wrapped the blanket around her shoulders. The air was cool. Somewhere outside, a rooster crowed. The world, unbelievably, had continued. She found James near the fence line again. He was repairing a hinge, working slowly, methodically, as though there were all the time in the world. When he noticed her, he straightened and gave a small nod. Not a greeting, not an order, just acknowledgement. She hesitated. Her heart pounded, not with fear this time, but with something sharper. Purpose, maybe, or necessity. She had been watching him for days now, how he spoke gently to the horses, how he never raised his voice, how he gave without asking. She had seen men with power before. They used it like a weapon. This man carried it like a responsibility. In her world, survival had always meant attachment, to a father, to a brother, to an officer, to someone who could shield you from the worst of the storm. She had learned that standing alone was the most dangerous position of all. So she stepped forward. He looked up, surprised, as she stood too close for comfort. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She searched for the words she had practiced in the dark, the ones she had whispered into her blanket like a prayer. I be wife, she said. The words came out broken, uneven, but unmistakable. The world seemed to freeze. The chickens stopped clucking. The breeze stilled. Even the dust seemed to hang in the air, listening. James stared at her, mouth slightly open. He glanced behind her, half expecting someone else to step forward and explain. No one did. The other men nearby had gone quiet, eyes flicking between them in disbelief. I be your wife, she said again, more firmly this time. I cook, I work, I stay. Her hands trembled, but she didn't lower them. In her mind, this was logical. This was safety. This was survival with rules she could understand. A man protected a woman. A woman served the household. This was how the world worked. It was not romance. It was not desperation. It was structure. James swallowed. His face reddened, not with anger, but something closer to shock. He rubbed the back of his neck, a habit she had seen when he didn't know what to say. "No," he said quietly. "No, you don't have to do that." She frowned. The words didn't make sense. "You, good man," she said slowly. "You no hurt me. I work. I stay." Around them, a few of the other men had stopped pretending not to listen. One let out a low whistle. Another shook his head, half amused, half stunned. The moment hovered, fragile and dangerous. James exhaled, long and slow. "You don't owe me anything," he said. "Not for food, not for shelter, not for kindness." She stared at him, searching his face for the trick, the hidden price. There was none. That was the problem. In her world, nothing was free. Everything had a cost. And yet here was a man telling her she owed nothing. Something inside her cracked. Her shoulders shook once, then again. She bowed her head, not in submission, but in confusion. Tears slipped down her cheeks, silent and hot. She had offered herself because it was the only language she knew for survival, and now that language had failed her. James took a step back, giving her space, his voice low. "You don't need to be anyone's wife to stay alive here." The words hit her harder than any blow. Around them, the camp seemed to hold its breath. Later, people would talk about that moment, about the girl who offered herself and the man who refused. It would become a story passed in murmurs, changed slightly with every telling. But in that moment, there was no legend, only a young woman realizing for the first time that survival might not require surrender. She wiped her face with the back of her hand and nodded once, as if accepting a truth she had never been allowed to consider. And somewhere inside her, something shifted, not broken, not healed, but changed forever. If this story is moving you, please take a moment to like the video and share where you're watching from. Your support helps keep stories like this alive. The morning she was given the paper, Aiko held it like it might vanish. It was thin, almost translucent, the kind used in field kits or ration logs. Alongside it, a stub of pencil, dull, worn, but still capable of leaving a mark. A guard gestured toward the makeshift table and said something about writing home. "Just once," he added with a grin. "One chance, one page." Aiko sat in silence, staring at the empty paper. For a long time she didn't move. What could she say? What should she say? Her language, once full of rules, proverbs, and the stiff politeness of survival, now felt like an ill-fitting kimono, too tight in the wrong places, too loose in others. But eventually, the words came. To her aunt in Okayama, the only relative she knew might still be alive, she wrote slowly, carefully, in broken kana. "I eat, I sleep, I am not afraid." She paused, then added, "They are not cruel. And finally, I laugh sometimes." That last sentence stayed with her. She erased it once, then wrote it again. The letter passed through the usual channels, U.S. military censors first, who found it harmless. Then it was sent across the ocean to the shattered remnants of Japan's intelligence network. There, the reaction was not so simple. To the American staff, it was a personal update, a human story, a girl telling her family she was okay. To the Japanese intelligence corps, it was a fire alarm, because the name was recognized. Aiko's name had once been on the Teishintai roster, volunteer nursing girls near the southern front, and the rumor of a girl offering herself in marriage to a cowboy had already reached whispered circles among imperial remnants. When the letter was intercepted, it confirmed their worst fear, that their captured daughters weren't being abused, they were being changed. That terrified them more than torture ever could. If one girl wrote that she wasn't afraid, then perhaps others would stop fearing too. If one girl laughed, then the world they had, built on grief and loyalty, might collapse in on itself. They filed the letter into a locked drawer. It was never delivered, but they could not unwrite her words. They could not unlive her truth. Back in Texas, Iko didn't know about the panic her small message caused. She didn't know her letter would never arrive. She only knew that for the first time in her life, she had written a sentence no one told her to write. And it had been simple, and it had been true. She ate, she slept, she was not afraid. The pencil had felt heavy in her hand, but afterward she felt lighter, like some invisible yoke had loosened on her shoulders. She had put her name to something without shame. That mattered. In the quiet of the barn that evening, she told James she had written a letter. He nodded and handed her a small biscuit wrapped in cloth. "No war words," he said gently. "Just good ones, right?" She nodded. "Good ones only." He tapped the side of his head and smiled. "Those stay. Longer, anyway." That night, the air smelled faintly of cattle and distant rain. She curled up on the cot and watched the rafters overhead. There were cracks in the wood, lines that splintered and curved, but held together nonetheless. Like her. The war had taken her family, her country, her past. But not her voice, not anymore. By late spring, the war was no longer something Iko could feel in her bones. The hunger that had once hollowed out her face had faded. Her frame had filled out, slow and steady, like a tree learning to stand again after a storm. She still bore the scars, both seen and hidden, but she had weight now, strength, and something else, something no mirror could show. A center. The day of departure came without warning. Orders arrived. The War Department had finalized repatriation lists. The girls, now women, were to be taken back across the Pacific. Home. If home still existed. No one cried. There was no weeping, no clinging to barn posts or begging to stay. But the silence that settled over the camp was heavier than gunfire. James found her early that morning. He didn't speak, just handed her a folded canvas coat. She took it, confused. Inside the pocket was a single sugar cube and a tin of ointment for cracked hands. His eyes flicked toward the horses. "Come on," he said. "One more ride." She climbed up behind him without hesitation. The sun hadn't yet crested the hills when they rode out. Dust rose behind them in slow spirals, and the cattle turned their heads briefly, then went back to chewing. The wind carried the scent of mesquite and old hay. They didn't speak. There was no need. Everything that could be said had been spoken through spoons, laughter, and shared glances over steaming bowls of soup. When they reached the fence line, the invisible edge where freedom and duty divided, the truck was already there. A few other girls waited quietly, their expressions unreadable. Iko stayed in the saddle for a beat longer, watching the way the sky cracked open in bands of pink and gold. Then, slowly, she slid down. She turned to James. He didn't move. His hat shadowed his face, but she could still see the line of his jaw, tight and still. Her hand hovered for a moment, then dropped. Words failed in every language. Instead, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small ribbon, faded blue, frayed at one edge. She tied it gently around a slat in the fence, fingers trembling not with fear, but with something close to reverence. It fluttered in the breeze like a whisper. He didn't ask what it meant. She didn't explain. But they both understood. She walked to the truck and climbed aboard. The engine sputtered to life. Dust kicked up in the wake as the wheels rolled forward. Iko didn't look back, not with her eyes. But something inside her turned, lingered, and stayed. The ribbon waved like a flag that no nation claimed. Months later, when the truck emptied onto the docks of Yokohama and the girls stepped onto shattered soil, She felt the pull of two worlds inside her. Japan was the land of her blood, but Texas, dusty, strange, warm Texas, had given her back her breath. There was no parade, no welcome, no medals, just silence. But in that silence, she stood taller. She knew what kindness felt like now, what dignity sounded like in a cowboy's quiet laughter. She knew the shape of freedom, not as a country, but as a choice, a language, a spoon, a ribbon tied to a fence post. Somewhere across the sea, a man in a wide-brim hat might ride past that fence and glance at the fluttering blue, wondering if the wind carried a message meant just for him. It did. If this story moved you, please like the video and leave a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. Thank you for helping us remember the moments history almost forgot.